The morning sun had barely lifted above the hedges when Richard Hale, a billionaire known for his sprawling empire and equally sprawling estate, walked into his garden. He had risen early, restless after a long night of calls, and thought a walk through the property would clear his head. But what he saw as he turned the corner by the orchard stopped him in his tracks. On the far side of the lawn, near a row of neatly trimmed flower beds, his maid, Kate, was on her knees. She wasn't pulling weeds or trimming stems. She was chewing. Her hands clutched fistfuls of grass and leaves, trembling as she stuffed them into her mouth with desperate speed. For a moment, Richard thought his eyes were deceiving him. Surely no one in his household, under his roof, could be reduced to such an act. He stood frozen, unable to speak, until Kate's head jerked up and she realized she was being watched. The panic in her eyes was unmistakable. She scrambled to her feet, brushing at her uniform, her lips pressed tightly together as though to hide the evidence. Richard approached, confusion giving way to alarm. "Kate," he said, his voice low but firm. "What are you doing?" She lowered her gaze, hands twisting together. "Nothing, sir. Just cleaning up the beds." "Don't lie to me," Richard said, not harshly, but with a weight that made her shoulders slump. "I saw you. You were eating the grass." Hello, family. Welcome to Heartfelt Stories. If you are hooked in and ready to enjoy this, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. It means the world to us. And tell us where you are watching from in the comment. Now, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. For several long seconds, she said nothing. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the distant hum of the groundskeeper's tools. Finally, her voice cracked as she whispered, "I was hungry." Richard blinked. "Hungry? The kitchen is right there." He gestured back toward the mansion. "Why would you?" She shook her head quickly, as if the explanation might shame her further. "I don't eat there. I haven't eaten properly in days." His confusion deepened. "Why not?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to answer. "Because every cent I earn here goes to my son. He's sick, Mr. Hale. A heart condition. The medicine is expensive, and the hospital bills never stop. If I spend even $1 on myself, it feels like stealing from him. So I send it all." Richard's chest tightened. He had expected excuses, maybe even denial, but not this. Not the image of a mother so desperate to save her child that she would starve quietly, surviving on the only thing she could reach, blades of grass in a billionaire's garden. He stared at her, struggling to reconcile the truth with the life of luxury that surrounded him. His home had a pantry stocked to the ceiling, chefs preparing multi-course meals, dining tables laid out with silver and crystal. Yet here was Kate, living under the same roof, with nothing in her stomach but grass. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Her answer was immediate. "Because people don't listen, sir. And when they do, they say it's not their problem. I didn't want to lose my job. I didn't want to seem ungrateful." Richard felt a flush of shame. How many times had he walked past her in the hallways without noticing the dark circles under her eyes, the way her uniform hung more loosely on her frame each month? How often had he ignored the quiet exhaustion etched across her face? For a man who prided himself on running a business empire with precision, he had failed to see suffering happening right in front of him. "Kate," he said carefully, "from this day forward, you won't go hungry again. Do you understand me?" Her eyes flicked upward, searching his face for signs of pity or mockery. Finding neither, she nodded, though her body remained tense, braced against disappointment. Richard stood there for a long while after she left, his mind turning. The scene had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just her hunger that disturbed him. It was the realization of how blind he had been. He lived in a world of glass towers and shareholder meetings, of contracts and mergers. But within his own household, a woman entrusted to his employment had been reduced to eating grass to survive. He replayed her words in his mind. "Every cent I earn goes to my son." The simplicity of it cut deeper than any accusation. She wasn't reckless or careless. She was disciplined to the point of self-destruction. And the cost was visible in every trembling motion, every pained glance. As he walked back toward the house, Richard felt a weight pressing against him. Questions he had long avoided surfaced with startling clarity. How much did he really know about the people who worked for him? Did he ever ask where their wages went? or what their families endured? Or had he convinced himself that writing a paycheck absolved him of responsibility? That night, Richard found himself unable to sleep. He sat alone in his study, staring at the untouched drink on his desk. The image of Kate kneeling in the grass replayed again and again, each time sharpening his sense of guilt. He thought of his own daughter, safely tucked into bed, her health secured by the best doctors money could buy. What would he have done if the situation had been reversed? If it were his child, and survival meant stripping dignity to its barest threads? For the first time in years, Richard felt powerless. His wealth, his empire, his influence, none of it erased the reality that he had failed someone who had placed their trust in him. The following morning, he resolved to act. But before he could make decisions, he needed the truth. Not just Kate's truth, but the truth of what went on inside his own house when he wasn't looking. Because if Kate had been forced to such desperation, perhaps she wasn't the only one. And that thought chilled him more than anything. The day after Richard discovered Kate in the garden, he couldn't focus. Calls from London, reports from his executive team, even a scheduled meeting with investors, all blurred into background noise. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her trembling hands, clutching grass as though it were food. By mid-afternoon, Richard gave up the pretense of work. He crossed the marble hallway of the Hale mansion and headed toward the servants' wing, a part of the estate he rarely entered. The quiet here was different, stripped of luxury, the air heavy with the smell of detergent and worn furniture. It was here, he thought, that truth lived, out of sight from gala guests and magazine photographers. He found Kate in the laundry room again. She was ironing uniforms, her posture stiff, her face carefully blank. When she saw him at the door, her body tensed. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, "if Mrs. Hale sees you here." "I don't care what Victoria thinks," Richard interrupted. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His voice lowered. "Kate, yesterday. I need the truth. All of it." She set the iron aside, her hands trembling slightly. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence pressed down until finally, her voice broke through. "My son's name is Daniel," she said. Her words were quiet, but steady. "He's 8 years old. He was born with a heart condition. The doctors say he needs medication, constant care. Some days he can't even play outside. Without treatment," she trailed off, shaking her head. Richard felt a knot tighten in his chest. "Where is he?" "With my sister in Atlanta. She takes care of him while I'm here." "But the costs." Kate closed her eyes briefly. "The medicine alone is more than I earn in a month. I send everything I make here to them. Every cent. That's why I don't eat. That's why." She stopped, her voice faltering. "That's why you saw me in the garden." The words hung heavy in the room. Richard glanced around at the plain laundry walls, the stack of pressed linens waiting to be delivered upstairs. In this space, so removed from his world of luxury, Kate's struggle was laid bare. "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked. "I could have helped." Kate finished for him, her gaze finally lifting to meet his. There was no anger in her tone, only weariness. "Sir, people like me don't ask for help. Because when we do, it's used against us. We're called lazy, ungrateful, weak. And then the job disappears. I couldn't risk it. Not with Daniel's life depending on me." Richard's throat felt dry. He realized that in his world, problems were solved with money, strategy, or influence. But for Kate, every day was a negotiation for survival, one she waged silently, alone. A sharp voice cut through the room, startling them both. "Richard." They turned to see Victoria Hale standing in the doorway. She was immaculate as always, her hair swept into a glossy twist, diamonds at her ears. But her eyes burned with suspicion. "What exactly is going on here?" she demanded. Richard straightened. "I'm speaking with Kate." "About what?" Victoria's gaze flicked to the maid, lingering with disdain. "Surely not about household matters." "That's my responsibility." Kate lowered her head instantly, backing away toward the ironing board. "I should get back to work." "No," Richard said firmly. He turned to his wife. "This is important." Victoria's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Important?" "Richard," she staffed. "You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Appearances matter. Do you have any idea how it would look if word got out that one of our maids," she gestured vaguely at Kate, "was caught doing whatever it is you claim you saw?" Richard's jaw tightened. I'm not concerned with appearances. I'm concerned with reality. Victoria's expression hardened. Reality is this, Richard, the staff work under me. They follow my rules. If Kate has problems, she takes them up with me, not you. Her voice softened, though her eyes remained cold. And if she cannot manage, then perhaps she doesn't belong here at all. Kate flinched at the words, her hand tightening around the iron's handle. Richard's reply was measured, but firm. No one is leaving. Not her. Not now. For a moment, the silence between husband and wife was as sharp as glass. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line, and without another word, she turned on her heel and swept out of the room. Kate stood frozen, her chest rising and falling quickly. "Sir," she whispered, "you shouldn't have defended me. It will only make things harder." Richard shook his head. "What I saw in that garden was harder than anything Victoria can say. Kate, you've carried this alone long enough." Her eyes glistened, but she remained silent. For Richard Hale, the revelation marked a turning point. What began as a shocking sight in his garden had unfolded into a truth too raw to ignore. Within the walls of his own home, one of his employees had been reduced to starving herself for the sake of her child. And while his wife dismissed it as inconvenience, Richard could not shake the conviction that this was a test of his humanity. That evening, Richard sat in his study once more, but this time he wasn't restless with guilt. He was determined. He pulled out a notepad and began scribbling notes, figures, estimates, names of charities and hospitals. But even as he drafted plans, one thought remained constant. This wasn't just about Daniel's treatment. It was about dignity, about seeing the people under his roof as more than names on a payroll. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, Kate lay awake on her narrow cot. The words from earlier replayed in her mind. "You won't go hungry again." She wanted to believe him, but she also knew promises, in her world, often faded with time. Still, for the first time in years, she allowed herself the smallest spark of hope. The Hale estate had always run with precision. Meals arrived at the table at the stroke of the hour, hedges were clipped into perfect symmetry, and the marble floors gleamed so brightly they reflected every passing shadow. To the outside world, it looked like the pinnacle of elegance and order. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. After Richard's encounter with Kate in the garden and his later confrontation in the laundry room, quiet ripples spread among the staff. They noticed his unusual presence in their quarters, the questions he asked, the way he lingered instead of passing by without acknowledgement. For years, the household staff had been invisible to the man at the top. Now, suddenly, he was listening. Victoria Hale noticed too. At breakfast one morning, she set down her teacup with deliberate force, her eyes fixed on her husband across the long table. "You've been spending far too much time downstairs," she said sharply, her voice as crisp as the starched napkin beside her plate. Richard looked up from his coffee. "Downstairs is where the truth is, Victoria. It's time I paid attention." The truth. Her tone dripped with disdain. "They're employees. Their role is to serve, not to be indulged. If you encourage complaints, you'll lose control of this house." Richard didn't flinch. If control means hunger and silence, then perhaps it's not worth keeping. The words struck like glass breaking between them. Victoria's face froze, her jaw tightening as she searched for a response. But instead of arguing, she finished her breakfast in silence, leaving the table with her composure intact and her fury carefully hidden. Later that afternoon, Richard stepped into the servants' dining hall. It was a plain, narrow room, scuffed tables, mismatched chairs, the faint smell of boiled vegetables clinging to the walls. The staff sat stiffly, their bowls of thin soup cooling in front of them. At the far end, Kate sat quietly, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the table. Richard's presence unsettled them. Conversation stopped. "I know this is unusual," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "But I want to hear from you directly. Are you treated fairly? Are you given enough to eat, enough rest, enough respect?" For a long moment, no one answered. The silence was thick, almost fearful. Then a young maid named Selina raised her hand hesitantly. "Sir, sometimes, if we make mistakes, we aren't allowed meals. Mrs. Hale says it teaches discipline." Richard's brows knitted. "Denied food? For making mistakes?" Another voice spoke, deeper, worn. "Raphael, The gardener. Last spring, I lost half a week's pay because I tracked mud on the carpet. Mud, sir. From repairing her irrigation line. I've never forgotten that. The dam broke. One by one, stories spilled into the air. A cook who had been humiliated for a guest's complaint. A driver who had endured 18-hour shifts without rest. A maid who had been scolded so severely she considered leaving without wages. Each testimony painted a darker picture than Richard could have imagined. Through it all, Kate remained silent, her head bowed. The weight of her secret, her son's illness, her months of starvation, still held her in place. But her silence did not erase the truth Richard had already seen with his own eyes. When the room finally fell quiet, he spoke again. I can't undo what's been done, but I will not allow it to continue. This house will change. The staff looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and hope. For years, their words had carried no weight. Now, perhaps, they might finally matter. That night, Victoria confronted her husband in their bedroom. Her voice was sharp, her anger no longer concealed. You've undermined me in front of the staff. Do you realize what you've done? You've made me look powerless in my own home. They were never your prisoners, Victoria, Richard said firmly. You've ruled with fear. That ends now. Her eyes narrowed, her voice cold. And what about Kate? Don't think I haven't noticed your sudden interest in her. Is this what it's about? A maid with a tragic story? Richard stiffened. This isn't about sentiment. It's about human dignity. Victoria laughed bitterly. Dignity? She scrubs floors, Richard. That's what she was hired for. You're risking everything. Our name, our reputation, for someone who will never matter outside these walls. His voice was calm, but unyielding. She matters. They all do. And if that destroys our reputation, then it's a reputation I no longer want. Victoria's hands trembled at her sides. She turned sharply and left the room without another word, her silence filled with unspoken threat. The following morning, Kate stood at the edge of the West Garden, clutching a folded letter in her apron pocket. It had arrived the night before, scrawled in her sister's familiar handwriting. She unfolded it, her eyes darting across the lines. Daniel's condition is worsening. The doctors say surgery is the only chance. We don't know how long he is left without it. Please, Kate, we need help. Her breath caught, the paper trembling in her hands. She pressed it to her chest, closing her eyes. Every sacrifice she had made, every skipped meal, every silent endurance, it had all been for her son. And now, time was slipping through her fingers faster than she could grasp it. At that same moment, inside the mansion, Richard stood in his study, staring at the grand oil portraits of his family lining the walls. For the first time, he no longer saw legacies of honor and wealth. He saw silence. Silence that had hidden cruelty. Silence that had excused suffering. Silence that had starved a mother under his roof. The house that had always seemed flawless was beginning to reveal its cracks. And through those cracks, truth was forcing its way in. Richard Hale had always run his companies with precision, annual audits, compliance checks, and evaluations that left no detail unexamined. Now, for the first time, he applied those same principles to his own home. Within days of speaking with the staff, he brought in a private auditor, an old friend from his corporate circle, discreet but thorough. The man was tasked not with finances, but with documenting the treatment of household employees. Pay records, work hours, meals provided, punishments administered. Every detail was to be logged. The staff, nervous at first, began to speak more openly once they realized the questions came with Richard's authority. Quiet testimonies were taken in side rooms, stories of withheld wages, of insults and intimidation, of meals stripped away for minor mistakes. Each account added weight to the growing file of evidence. Kate remained reluctant. She kept to herself, her silence heavy with fear. But Richard noticed her hesitation. He saw the way her hands tightened around her apron whenever questions were asked, the way her eyes darted when Victoria entered the room. Meanwhile, Victoria was not blind to what was happening. She moved through the estate with her usual poise, but her anger simmered just beneath the surface. In private, she began making calls to her social circle, warning that Richard was becoming unbalanced, too easily swayed by emotional stories. She framed his actions as a threat to the household's reputation, quietly sowing seeds of doubt among those who once admired him. At dinner one evening, she tested her strategy directly. "You've brought chaos into this house," she said across the table, her tone controlled but icy. "The staff are whispering, second-guessing, imagining themselves as equals. That is not how a household of our stature is run." Richard cut his steak slowly, his movements deliberate. "If treating them with dignity creates whispers, then I welcome the noise. Silence has done enough damage." Her eyes flashed. "You're undermining me in front of them. Do you think they'll respect me now? You've stripped away the order I built." "The order you built," he said firmly, "was built on fear. That ends here." Victoria set down her fork, her composure cracking for the briefest moment. "And if you continue, you'll regret it." The words lingered in the air long after the plates were cleared. The following morning, Richard asked Kate to meet him in the conservatory, away from the prying eyes of the staff. She entered cautiously, the soft click of her shoes echoing against the tiled floor. "I know this isn't easy," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "But the truth matters. If what I've heard from the others is true, your story will make it undeniable." Kate hesitated, twisting her hands together. "Sir, Mrs. Hale will find out. If she decides to fire me, I won't find another job. No one hires a maid with a reputation for trouble. And if that happens, my son," her voice caught. Richard leaned forward, his tone gentler. "Kate, I've seen the cost you've already paid. I won't let her take your livelihood. Not after what you've endured. Trust me with this." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded slowly. "My son's name is Daniel," she whispered, as though saying it aloud gave the truth more weight. "He's 8. He has a heart condition, and the doctors say he'll need surgery soon. Every dollar I make here goes to him. Medicine, hospital visits, everything. There's nothing left for me. Sometimes, not even food." Richard felt the same sharp pang he had felt in the garden. "And you've carried this alone?" She nodded. "Because asking for help always feels like weakness. And in this house, weakness is punished." The words cut deeper than he expected. He closed his notebook, meeting her gaze. "Not anymore. You've been punished enough." That evening, Richard gathered the staff in the servants' hall. He stood at the head of the room, not as their employer, but as a man determined to right a wrong. "I want you all to know something," he began. "From this day forward, no one in this house will go hungry. No one will be punished with lost meals or stolen wages. And no one will live in fear." The staff exchanged stunned looks. Selena, the young maid, covered her mouth with her hand. Raphael sat straighter, his shoulders easing for the first time in months. Kate looked down at her folded hands, her throat tight. She wanted to believe his words, but the echo of Victoria's threats still haunted her. Victoria herself was absent from the meeting, but word reached her within the hour. When she confronted Richard later, her fury was no longer veiled. "You've humiliated me in my own home," she spat, her voice low and venomous. "You've turned the staff against me, and for what? For that maid and her sob story." Richard's voice was calm, but resolute. "For humanity, Victoria. Something you seem to have forgotten." Her eyes narrowed. "You think you're saving her, but you're destroying yourself." He met her glare without flinching. "Then I'll take the destruction, because I won't let cruelty reign under my roof." The storm within the Hale estate was no longer quiet. Staff who had once moved like shadows now walked with cautious hope. Richard moved among them with a sense of purpose, while Victoria plodded in silence, her pride refusing to yield. And in the middle of it all was Kate, carrying a letter from her sister that never left her pocket. Every word reminded her that time was slipping away for Daniel. She could not afford patience, nor could she endure another setback. The battle between husband and wife was no longer abstract. It was becoming a countdown, and Kate knew that her son's survival might depend on which side prevailed. Victoria Hale had never lost control of anything. Not a dinner party, not a business partnership, not even her husband's attention. Yet over the past weeks, she felt the ground shift beneath her carefully managed world. Richard's quiet rebellion against her authority unsettled her, but what enraged her most was the maid, Kate. She couldn't forget the look on Richard's face that morning in the garden when he had discovered Kate's desperation. Sympathy, guilt, even admiration. Emotions Victoria had long dismissed as weaknesses, but which now threatened her dominance. Victoria decided if she couldn't shame Richard into obedience, she would break Kate instead. Her first move was subtle. The pantry, which Richard had ordered kept open to the staff, suddenly became restricted again. Locks reappeared on cabinets, and the kitchen staff, loyal to Victoria, tightened their control. Special instructions from Mrs. Hale, they whispered, turning away employees who came for food outside of designated hours. Kate felt the impact immediately. Though Richard had promised no one would go hungry, the reality of Victoria's command cut through that vow. Kate found herself rationing again, quietly slipping portions to Selena and Raphael, whose wages had not yet been adjusted. But the most dangerous blow came not from withheld meals, it came from rumor. One afternoon, as Kate carried linens through the upstairs hall, she overheard two maids whispering. They say she's pretending, that she makes up stories about her son to get sympathy. I heard Mrs. Hale say it herself. The child doesn't even exist. It's all an act. Kate froze. The linens nearly slipped from her arms. She wanted to confront them, to scream the truth, but fear held her tongue. If Victoria could convince others that Daniel was a lie, everything Kate had endured would unravel into humiliation. Richard sensed something was wrong when Kate began avoiding him. She kept her head down, her answers short, and her presence in the household seemed to shrink. At first, he thought it was fatigue, but one evening, as he crossed the courtyard, he caught sight of her on the back steps, shoulders shaking in quiet sobs. "Kate," he said softly, approaching. She stood quickly, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. I shouldn't be out here. You don't need to apologize." His voice carried a firmness that surprised even himself. "Tell me, what has she done now?" Kate hesitated, then whispered. "She says Daniel isn't real, that I made it up. And the others, some of them believe her." Richard's jaw tightened. It was one thing for Victoria to oppose him, but another entirely to strike at a child's existence. "You listen to me," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I don't care what lies she spreads. I believe you. And if she thinks she can destroy your truth, she's mistaken." Kate searched his face, desperate to find conviction in his words. She saw it there, steady as stone. The breaking point came during a charity gala hosted at the Hale estate. The event had been Victoria's idea, an opportunity to remind their circle of her influence, to show that the household was as pristine as ever. Guests filled the ballroom, their laughter echoing beneath crystal chandeliers, unaware of the war simmering beneath the surface. Victoria floated through the crowd in a sapphire gown, her smile sharp as glass. Richard, however, stood apart, his expression unreadable. Then, at the height of the evening, Victoria made her move. She stood near the orchestra, glass raised, and called for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began smoothly, "I want to thank you all for your generosity tonight. But before we continue, I must address a most unfortunate distraction." The guests turned toward her, curious. Richard's stomach dropped. "In recent weeks," Victoria continued, "our household has been plagued by a fabrication. A tale spun by one of our servants to manipulate sympathy. A sick child, invented to excuse negligence. I assure you, the Hale family does not tolerate dishonesty." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads turned toward the servants lined along the wall, where Kate stood frozen, the blood draining from her face. Richard moved before the silence could thicken. He stepped forward, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "Enough." Every head swiveled toward him. He rarely raised his voice in public, but tonight it carried authority that silenced even the orchestra. "There is no fabrication," Richard declared. "Daniel exists. He is fighting for his life, and his mother, Kate, has sacrificed everything for him. If you doubt it, I will provide the proof. But I will not stand by while my wife slanders an innocent woman in front of our guests." The room shifted uneasily. Murmurs spread, some shocked by his boldness, others intrigued. Victoria's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, her laugh ringing hollow. "My dear, you're embarrassing yourself." "No, Victoria," Richard said, his eyes locked on hers. "You've embarrassed this house. And tonight it ends." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Later that night, in the privacy of his study, Richard made a decision. If Victoria wanted a war of perception, he would fight it openly. He drafted letters to his legal team, instructing them to begin reviewing the household's management under Victoria's authority. Documents were to be prepared, proof of mistreatment, evidence of neglect. If necessary, he would take the matter to court. Kate, still shaken from the evening, tried to thank him the next morning. "You didn't have to defend me in front of them," she whispered. "Yes," Richard replied simply. "I did. Because truth doesn't survive in silence." For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. But as the days passed, the stakes grew higher. Victoria, humiliated in front of her peers, doubled down on her efforts. Servants loyal to her fed her information, and soon she began whispering in circles beyond the estate that Richard was unstable, that grief and guilt had clouded his judgment, that he was compromising his empire for the sake of a servant's lie. Her strategy was simple. If she could not silence Kate, she would isolate Richard. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Kate realized the truth. This was no longer just about her hunger or her son's illness. It was about power, and she had become the unwilling fulcrum of a battle that could topple the Hale family from within. The fallout from the gala spread faster than either Richard or Victoria had anticipated. The following morning, society columns carried whispers of the argument. Some painted Richard as a defender of dignity. Others mocked him for publicly siding with a maid against his own wife. Investors, too, began to notice. A few called, asking pointed questions about his state of mind. But Richard did not waver. If anything, the storm only hardened his resolve. He had built an empire on numbers, logic, and contracts. Yet the truth he now pursued was not measured in profit. It was measured in justice. Still, the tension inside the estate thickened with every passing day. Staff moved cautiously, aware that their loyalties were under scrutiny. Victoria's influence had not disappeared. It had merely shifted into the shadows. She summoned trusted servants in quiet meetings, reminding them who held the real power in the household. And then came the moment Richard had not anticipated. One evening, as he returned from the office, he found Kate waiting near the garden steps, her hands twisting a folded envelope. Her face was pale, her voice low. "Sir," she said, "I have news from the hospital." Richard took the envelope, recognizing the crest of St. Mary's, the facility where Kate had said her son was being treated. He opened it quickly, scanning the letter. His chest tightened as the words sank in. Daniel Hale, congenital heart defect, requires surgery within 3 months. Estimated cost, $78,000. Richard looked up. "This is real," he whispered, though he had never doubted her. "He's not just sick, he's running out of time." Kate's voice broke. "They won't schedule him without the deposit. I've sent every dollar I have, but it's not enough. If I can't raise the money." She couldn't finish the sentence. For a long moment, Richard stood in silence, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. This was no longer abstract suffering. This was a boy's life, hanging in the balance of dollars and deadlines. "You should have brought this to me sooner," he said gently. "I was afraid," Kate admitted. "Afraid no one would care." Richard folded the letter carefully. "Then hear me now. I care, and we will find a way." But Victoria was watching. Later that night, she confronted Richard in his study, her voice low and sharp. "So it's true, then. You've decided to spend our fortune on her brat." Richard's eyes flashed. "His name is Daniel. And if saving his life is a crime, then I am guilty without shame." Victoria's laughter was cold. "Do you think the board will support you when they learn you're draining assets for a servant's child? Do you think shareholders will applaud when their dividends shrink? No, Richard. They'll see a man who's lost control." "You're blinded by pride," he shot back. "This isn't about money. It's about what kind of people we choose to be." Her smile hardened. "And I choose to protect what's mine. If you won't, then I will." Richard knew then that her retaliation would not stop at whispers. The next week, the consequences of Victoria's defiance began to appear. One by one, allies Richard had counted on grew distant. A longtime investor delayed a meeting. A board member refused his calls. Articles began to appear in business magazines, questioning whether the great Richard Hale had lost his touch. Kate noticed the change, too. Staff who had once smiled at her now avoided eye contact, fearful of being seen as aligned with her. Rumors grew sharper, that she had seduced Richard, that Daniel was not sick at all but a ploy for sympathy, that she was tearing the Hale family apart. She bore the whispers in silence, but inside, she feared the weight of guilt. What if Richard truly did lose everything because of her? One evening, Richard made a decision. He called Kate into the library, where firelight flickered against dark shelves. "Kate," he began, "I want to meet your son." Her breath caught. You mean it?" "Yes. I won't allow his life to be reduced to rumors and whispers. I need to see him, to understand fully what you've endured. Will you allow me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. "Tomorrow, I'll take you to him." The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and faintly of despair. Richard walked beside Kate through the pale corridors, his heart pounding. He had walked into boardrooms, into courts, into negotiations worth billions, but nothing had prepared him for this. They stopped at a small room where a boy lay curled under thin blankets. His skin was pale, his frame small, but when he saw his mother, his face lit with a tired but genuine smile. "Mom," he whispered. Kate hurried to his side, brushing his hair back tenderly. "Daniel, this is Mr. Hale. He's here to help." Richard stepped forward slowly. The boy's eyes were large, curious but cautious. "Hello, Daniel," Richard said softly. "Your mother has told me how brave you are." Daniel blinked, then offered the faintest smile. "I don't feel very brave." Richard's throat tightened. He crouched beside the bed. "Bravery isn't about how you feel. It's about fighting even when you're scared. And from what I see, you're the bravest boy I've ever met." Kate turned away slightly, wiping her eyes. That night, as Richard drove back from the hospital, his mind churned. The empire he had built suddenly felt hollow in comparison to the fragile boy he had just met. And yet, he knew the world would not see it that way. To investors, Daniel was not a child in need. He was a liability. Victoria's voice echoed in his mind. They'll see a man who's lost control. But for the first time, Richard didn't care. Control was meaningless if it meant abandoning what was right. The following morning, Victoria made her boldest move yet. She summoned Richard to the ballroom, where two lawyers awaited with crisp folders. "Sign them," she said coolly. "A revision of household management. You relinquish your authority here, and I take full control. Otherwise, the board will learn everything, and you'll lose more than this house." Richard glanced at the documents, then back at her. "You would rather destroy your husband than admit you're wrong." Her smile was razor thin. "I'd rather destroy anyone who threatens me." For a moment, Richard considered his options. To sign would mean surrendering Kate and Daniel to Victoria's cruelty. To refuse would mean risking his empire, his reputation, perhaps even his family name. He placed the pen on the table, untouched. "I won't," he said firmly, "because some things are worth more than power." Victoria's expression darkened. "Then prepare to lose everything." The household, once merely divided, was now on the edge of collapse. Richard had chosen his side openly. Victoria had declared war. And in the middle stood Kate, her son's life ticking down with every passing day, her dignity caught in the clash of two worlds. The storm had broken, and it was only the beginning. The storm that had been brewing inside the Hale estate finally spilled beyond its walls. The media, once fascinated by Richard Hale's genius as a billionaire CEO, now latched onto scandal. Headlines were blunt and merciless. House divided. Hale empire shaken by servant's story. CEO Richard Hale loses grip on household control. Maid or manipulator? Questions surround sick child claim. Victoria read them with quiet satisfaction, her lips curving as columnists echoed her narrative. In her mind, the battle was nearly won. All she had to do was isolate Richard further until he had no allies left. But Richard had something Victoria underestimated: resolve. It began with an unexpected press conference. One morning, reporters gathered outside Hale Global's headquarters, expecting updates on a pending merger. Instead, Richard stood at the podium, his jaw set, a folder clutched in his hand. "Many of you have heard rumors about my household," he began. "And while I normally keep my private life private, today I will not allow lies to overshadow truth." He opened the folder and revealed hospital records. "This is Daniel. He is 8 years old. He has a serious heart condition. His mother, Kate, one of our employees, has sacrificed everything for his care. She has endured hunger, humiliation, and cruelty simply to keep him alive. And I will not be silent while her suffering is mocked. The crowd erupted with questions. Richard held up a hand. I am not here for sympathy. I am here for responsibility. We must stop pretending that those who serve us do not bleed, suffer, or love. My fortune means nothing if I ignore the humanity of those who help build it. If that costs me shareholders, so be it. If it costs me reputation, so be it. I will not stand on the shoulders of suffering. The room went silent, cameras flashing in rapid bursts. For the first time, Richard Hale was not speaking as a CEO, but as a man. Victoria's fury was incandescent. When she saw the broadcast replay on the evening news, she hurled a crystal glass across the room, the shards scattering across marble floors. He's destroyed us, she seethed. All for her. Her closest confidant tried to soothe her. Perhaps the storm will pass. The public loves a redemption story. Redemption? Victoria snapped. He's made a fool of me, and I will not forgive it. She devised a new plan. If she could not silence Kate through rumor, she would crush her with exposure. Days later, Kate received a summons, not from Richard, but from Victoria. She was ordered to appear in the Grand Hall. Reluctantly, she obeyed, her stomach twisting with dread. When she arrived, she found not only Victoria waiting, but several of the estate's wealthiest patrons seated like judges at a tribunal. At the center was a table with Kate's meager belongings laid bare. Letters from Daniel's doctors, photographs, bills, and the envelope she had once shown Richard. Victoria's voice was smooth, practiced. We've gathered here because questions remain about your story, Kate. Tonight, we will separate fact from fabrication. Kate's hands trembled as she looked at the evidence on display. Those were her private things, her son's life reduced to exhibits in a cruel performance. Tell us, Victoria pressed, her voice echoing through the hall. Why should anyone believe you? How do we know you haven't exaggerated your son's condition for attention? For gain? Kate swallowed hard. Every pair of eyes bore into her. She wanted to scream, to run, but instead she stood taller, clutching a photo of Daniel. Because this is not a game, she said, her voice cracking but strong. My son is real. His pain is real. And no amount of your wealth or cruelty will erase that. I would give my life for him. And if that makes me weak in your eyes, so be it. The room fell silent. Even Victoria's patrons shifted uneasily. And then Richard's voice rang out from the doorway. She doesn't need to prove anything to you. He strode into the hall, his presence commanding. The only reason this child's life is on trial is because my wife cannot bear the thought of her authority being questioned. But I will not let this farce continue. Victoria's face drained of color. You weren't invited. Richard ignored her, walking to Kate's side. I have seen Daniel with my own eyes. I have spoken to his doctors. And I will stand by Kate, no matter what it costs. His words hung heavy in the air. The tribunal dissolved into murmurs, several patrons rising to leave, unwilling to be pawns in Victoria's cruelty. For the first time, Victoria felt her grip slipping, not only over the staff, but over her public image. That night, Kate returned to the hospital, shaken but grateful. She clutched Daniel's hand as he slept, whispering promises through her tears. You'll be okay, my love. I'll protect you. Even if the world tries to tear us apart, I won't let go. But the monitors beside Daniel told another story. His heart condition was worsening. Tom was no longer on their side. When the doctor entered, his expression was grave. We need to schedule surgery immediately. Without it, he may not last the month. Kate's chest constricted. She knew the costs, the impossible mountain of debt. But before she could speak, Richard stepped forward. Do it, he said firmly. Schedule the surgery. I'll cover everything. Kate turned to him, her voice breaking. You've already risked so much because of me. Your reputation, your marriage, your empire. Richard shook his head. None of it matters more than this boy's life. Her tears spilled freely then, not of despair, but of a fragile, aching relief. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and sleepless nights. Daniel's surgery was scheduled, but the hospital required a deposit of nearly $80,000 up front. Richard covered it without hesitation, writing the check himself. The gesture sent shockwaves through his board. At the next shareholder meeting, one of the directors, a gray-haired man named Harrington, voiced what many others were thinking. "Richard," he said flatly, "you're bleeding resources into a personal matter. This isn't philanthropy, it's recklessness. If you can't separate your household from this company, we may be forced to act." Richard met his gaze without flinching. "Then act. My conscience isn't for sale." A murmur swept through the room. Some admired his defiance, others scowled. Richard knew the battle for his reputation was nearly lost. But if saving Daniel meant losing his empire, then so be it. Meanwhile, inside the estate, Victoria tightened her grip. Humiliated by Richard's press conference and tribunal interruption, she now wielded her influence like a blade. Staff loyal to her carried out quiet acts of sabotage, misplaced documents, delayed calls, whispers to investors. The narrative was shifting rapidly. Richard was no longer a titan of business, but a man unraveling, brought low by misplaced sympathy. And yet, amid the chaos, Kate felt a fragile light flicker. For the first time, Daniel's surgery was not a distant dream, but a scheduled reality. Each night she visited him, holding his hand as machines beeped softly in the background. She whispered prayers of gratitude and fear. Gratitude for Richard's sacrifice. Fear that Victoria would find some way to destroy it. Her fears proved justified. One morning, as Kate prepared to leave for the hospital, she was stopped at the estate gates. Two uniformed officers stood waiting. "Kate Thompson?" one asked. Her heart lurched. "Yes. You're under investigation," the officer said. "Allegations of fraud. Specifically, falsifying medical documents to manipulate financial assistance." Kate's knees weakened. "That's not true. My son is real. His condition is real." But the officers only shook their heads. "You'll need to come with us to answer questions." It was Victoria's most ruthless move yet. When Richard received the call, he stormed into the police station, his presence commanding even without his usual entourage. He demanded to see Kate, who sat pale and trembling in a small interview room. "They said the documents were forged," she whispered. "That Daniel isn't even admitted to St. Mary's." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This is her doing." "Victoria." He turned to the officers, his voice sharp. "I personally visited that hospital. I met the boy. Are you accusing me of fraud as well?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, the allegations came from a credible source." Richard leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. "A credible source, or a bitter wife?" Silence answered him. By the end of the day, the accusations were dropped, but the damage had been done. Kate's name had been dragged through official channels, her dignity bruised once more. She left the station shaken, clinging to the thought of Daniel. "Why won't she stop?" she whispered. "Because power is all she knows," Richard replied grimly. "And when power slips away, people become dangerous." On the eve of Daniel's surgery, the weight of it all nearly broke Kate. She sat beside her son's hospital bed, stroking his hair as he slept. "You don't have to fight alone anymore, sweetheart," she murmured. "Mr. Hale believes in you. And so do I." Daniel stirred, his small voice muffled by sleep. "Mom, are we going home soon?" Tears stung her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "as soon as you're better." In that quiet moment, Kate realized that no matter what Victoria did, she could not take this from her. Daniel was real. Their bond was real. And that truth was stronger than any lie. The morning of the surgery dawned gray and heavy. Richard accompanied Kate to the hospital, ignoring the photographers who gathered outside. When they entered the surgical ward, the doctor briefed them with careful precision. "There are risks," he said. "But without this procedure, he won't survive. You should prepare yourselves." Kate nodded, her hands trembling. Richard placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He'll come through," he said firmly. "He has your strength." As Daniel was wheeled into surgery, Kate broke down, clinging to Richard's arm. He held her steady, his gaze fixed on the double doors that closed between them and the boy. Hours dragged on like years. Every tick of the clock echoed in Kate's chest. She paced the corridor, whispered prayers, clutched the small toy car Daniel had insisted on bringing. At last, the surgeon emerged, mask pulled down, his expression unreadable. "The procedure was successful," he said. "He's weak, but he made it through." Kate collapsed into tears of relief. Richard closed his eyes, exhaling the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But even as Daniel fought his way back to health, Victoria prepared her final strike. From her vantage point, the surgery's success was irrelevant. What mattered was the empire Richard had gambled. At a board meeting held days later, she appeared unexpectedly, dressed in immaculate black. She carried a thick folder and placed it on the table. "Gentlemen," she began smoothly, "my husband has compromised this company. I submit a motion to remove him as CEO." Gasps rippled through the room. Richard, blindsided, rose to respond. "You have no authority here." But Victoria opened the folder, revealing documents, shareholder complaints, financial projections, and photographs of Richard at the hospital beside Kate. "Authority," she said coldly, "is given to those who protect the company. And you, Richard, have forgotten where your loyalty lies." The boardroom erupted into chaos. Some argued fiercely on Richard's behalf, others demanded accountability. In the end, a vote was called. When the tally was read, Richard's chest tightened. By the narrowest of margins, he had been removed. That evening, he walked through the empty halls of the estate, his footsteps echoing. He no longer carried the weight of CEO or the illusion of control. Yet as he entered the hospital room where Kate and Daniel waited, something shifted. Daniel looked up, his smile faint but genuine. "You came back." Richard knelt beside him, emotion raw in his voice. "I'll always come back." In that moment, he understood what Victoria never could. True power wasn't in titles or boardrooms or wealth. It was in the lives you chose to protect. And though he had lost everything in the eyes of the world, in Kate and Daniel's eyes, he had given them back their future. The day after the board's decision, the Hale estate was quieter than ever before. The grand halls that once echoed with the sounds of servants rushing and guests laughing now felt hollow, as if the house itself mourned the loss of its foundation. Richard Hale walked through it one last time, his hands brushing against the polished railings, the portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch in judgment. Victoria had won, or so she believed. She had taken the empire, silenced his influence, and made him a cautionary tale whispered in investor circles. Yet in her victory, there was no celebration. The staff moved stiffly around her, their gazes lowered, not out of respect, but out of fear. Even her closest allies kept their distance, uneasy with the ruthlessness that had been laid bare for all to see. Richard, meanwhile, carried no bitterness as he left the estate for good. His car did not take him to the office or a penthouse downtown. Instead, it drove him to the hospital, where Kate and Daniel waited. When he entered the room, Daniel's smile lit up the space brighter than any chandelier back at the mansion. "Mr. Hale," the boy exclaimed weakly, his voice still fragile from recovery. Richard smiled back, kneeling by the bed. "How's my fighter today?" "Better," Daniel whispered. "The doctor said I'll be able to run again someday. Maybe even play soccer." Kate's eyes welled with tears as she watched. "You gave him that chance," she said softly. "We can never repay you." Richard shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. If anything, I owe you for reminding me what truly matters." News of his downfall spread quickly, but so too did the story of what he had done. Journalists who had once mocked him began to publish a different angle. The billionaire who sacrificed his empire to save the life of a maid's child. Editorials debated his choices, but among ordinary people, his name carried a new kind of respect. He was no longer seen as untouchable, but as human. And humanity, it turned out, was what people admired most. Victoria, however, found herself cornered. At first, she reveled in her triumph. But cracks soon appeared. Without Richard's steady hand, Hale Global faltered. Investors grew wary of her leadership. The staff, once silently obedient, began resigning in waves, unwilling to endure her cruelty without Richard's balance. Within months, the empire she had fought to control began to slip through her fingers, and in society circles, whispers followed her everywhere, not of her wealth or her fashion, but of the night she tried to humiliate a mother fighting for her son. In the end, her reputation crumbled, not because Richard exposed her, but because the truth always rises. For Kate, life slowly shifted from desperation to hope. With Daniel's surgery behind him, she no longer woke each morning gripped by fear of losing him. She found part-time work outside the estate, where she was treated with dignity and respect. And though her heart still bore scars from years of silence and humiliation, she carried herself with new strength. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Richard joined Kate and Daniel for a walk in the park. Daniel, still frail but recovering, clutched Richard's hand on one side and his mother's on the other. They paused near a fountain, where the glow of lamplight reflected on the water. "Do you ever miss it?" Kate asked quietly. "The estate, the company, the life you had?" Richard thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I miss what I thought it was. But the truth is, none of it gave me what I've found here. With you. With him." Kate's chest tightened with emotion. She had once been invisible in his world, a maid surviving on scraps. Now, she was someone whose voice he valued, whose son he cherished. It was more than she had ever dared to imagine. Months later, Daniel ran for the first time across the park field, his laughter echoing in the air. Kate clapped her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Richard stood beside her, his smile wide, his heart lighter than it had been in years. In that moment, everything they had endured, the humiliation, the battles, the losses, faded into the background. What remained was life, raw and real. And Richard knew he had not lost everything. He had lost only what never truly mattered. What he had gained, love, purpose, redemption, was priceless. As the story of Richard, Kate, and Daniel circulated, it became more than gossip. It became a reminder to everyone who heard it. That power without compassion is hollow, and that true strength lies in standing up for those who cannot stand alone. And in living rooms and offices, in kitchens and cafes, people debated not the fall of a billionaire, but the rise of something greater, a man who discovered his humanity, a mother who refused to give up, and a boy whose second chance reminded the world what really matters. This story reminds us that no amount of wealth can replace the value of kindness and courage. What lesson did you take away from Richard and Kate's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that prove the human spirit is stronger than anything.